Sri Lanka has, I think, a bunch of short-term issues and a couple of very long-term issues. Let me set the backdrop because I think this is really interesting. Let's study Sri Lanka through the lens of two other countries, Jamaica and Singapore. If you go all the way back to 1960, so roughly when Singapore became a nation, the Jamaican population in 1960 was 1.6 million people. The Singaporean population was 1.6 million people. Sri Lanka's population was 9.8 million. Jamaica's GDP was 700 million. Singapore's GDP was 700 million. Sri Lanka's was 1.4 billion. Now you fast forward to 2022, Jamaica's GDP is about 13 billion. Singapore's GDP has grown to about 360 billion, and Sri Lanka's GDP is 80 billion. So, what did Singapore do right? What did Jamaica kind of get right? Because one of the things that they kept in check was their population, even though their GDP didn't expand that much, so per capita income was still quite healthy. And then what did Sri Lanka get right and what did Sri Lanka get wrong? Well, some of the things when you look at Singapore is that they found a way to embrace, despite a very heterogeneous culture and sets of religions inside of that entity, inside that city-state, they found a way to promote multiculturalism, yet also promote English as the lingua franca. Why was that small thing so important? Because it allowed them to be a hub for the rest of the world in a way that many, many other countries couldn't do. The second thing that they had was a very low level of corruption because they had a leader, in that case, Lee Kuan Yew. And again, some people in the West will paint it as slightly authoritarian. He would paint it as Asian values. But the net result of it was very low levels of corruption, a small but highly effective public service, and meaningful investments in education and healthcare to make that country grow over decades. And within a generation, that country completely, exceeded all expectations. Sri Lanka struggled through a civil war. I was a byproduct of that civil war. It was partly religious, it was partly ethnic, and it was 20 plus years in the making and in the happening. And it took a very right-wing autocratic leader, the brother of the current deposed president, to basically root it out. Now, in order to root it out, there were enormous amounts of war crimes and all kinds of things that I don't think anybody would support, except it brought some amount of stability. And so then you would have thought, okay, maybe this is the point at which you can now really start to grow. But these guys, yet again, found a way to navel gaze and just to infuse so much corruption and graft inside of how the government was run. By the way, and it wasn't just the right, it was also the left. They spent 2.5 times more on defense as of last year than they did when they were in wartime. Doesn't make much sense. The public service grew to the largest it ever did in a moment where, you really should have prioritized private enterprise. So all of these things sort of created a situation where they fundamentally didn't know what they were doing.
So the other two issues there, I think, and that's a great summary of really those frontier countries and what made them emerge. Singapore also has a great strategic location, which Sri Lanka kind of shares. They're both island countries strategically located for trade. And then I guess the policies, right? Singapore went on a very, very aggressive tax and business policy effort. Did Sri Lanka do that as well? And then maybe you could speak to just how important those are as islands, and their geography, because Jamaica doesn't obviously have that.
I mean, Sri Lanka has this massive growing importance as China has emerged. The problem in these last few years is that they did everything possible to not just alienate China, but to alienate everybody on every dimension possible. They alienated China. The coup de grace was that there was an enormous shipment of fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, that was sent to the ports. And it was summarily rejected and turned around because somewhere along the way, the leadership in Sri Lanka decided that they were woke. And so they had forced every farmer to go organic. The problem with going organic and organic fertilizer was all of the small farms shut down. All of the large farms had 20 to 30% crop yield reductions. The prices of food went crazy. They reversed policies 2 or 3 times. And really what they found is that, they tried to go woke. Instead, they went broke. And all of a sudden, all these other countries who were there trying to help said, wait, what is going on here? So they offended China. They offended the Middle Easterners. They offended the Japanese by cutting a light rail project that Japan wanted to fund. I mean, in every step of the way.
They deindustrialized.
This country found a way. They didn't deindustrialize. They tried to follow this woke agenda.
That is deindustrialization. I mean, reversing from like the modern techniques of industrial production, like fertilizer and modern systems of farming, is deindustrialization. It's going to be a curse ultimately.